Mitch Jeserich. I want to begin today's show by reflecting upon my friend and colleague at KPFA, Bob Baldock, who died this past weekend at the age of 85. Bob Baldock was the man behind all of KPFA events in the San Francisco Bay Area for the past few decades. He brought the likes of Gore Vidal, Angela Davis, Christopher Hitchens, Molly Ivins, Alice Walker, Chris Hedges, Cornel West, Noam Chomsky, Ai-jen Poo, Richard Wolff, our guest today, John Nichols, and many, many more to local stages so that we could interact with them. Bob Baldock was also quite the artist. All of the KPFA event posters that you saw around town advertising an event was created by him. As someone who works at KPFA, seeing his posters around made me just feel good. An amazing fact about Bob Baldock is that he was one of a very few Americans who participated in the Cuban Revolution of 1959. We have photos on our station walls, old black and white photos of a tall and slim and young Bob Baldock. He remained tall and slim, that lucky son of a gun. We had these black and white photos of him in the mountains hanging out and talking with Fidel Castro during the revolution. It was something that he was proud about, and it was something that we were all fascinated about, knowing that we worked with a man who participated in that revolution, who was a part of history. Bob Baldock was a man of conviction, that's obvious, but he was also very kind and always supportive and always open to criticism and different ways of seeing things. I have had the great privilege to know and work with many people from the older generation of KPFA, and each and every one of them, including Bob Baldock, have left their mark on the station, on our community, and on me. I always remember in times like these Henry David Thoreau's some of his final words to his sister just before he died of tuberculosis when he said, "It's time for smooth sailing." Well, it's time for smooth sailing, Bob. May you rest in peace. Now on to today's program. We are going to preview not next week, but the week after, midterm election. Our guest for this is John Nichols. John Nichols is the national affairs correspondent with The Nation magazine. He has an upcoming piece out that will be out tomorrow, so he'll be with us today to scoop himself on our program. The piece tomorrow, and you want to look at it at thenation.com, is called "Donald Trump Has Cursed the GOP with a Clown Car Slate of Senate Candidates." We are broadcasting live today. We are going to take listener phone calls for people who are listening to us live throughout California. If you listen to us, say where John Nichols is at WORT in Madison, regrettably you hear us a few hours after we record this live, so I regret you won't be able to participate with us. But if you are listening to us live throughout California, the number you are going to call, if you want to talk about the upcoming election, 1-800-958-9008. 1-800-958-9008. We are also broadcasting live on YouTube. You can just find our YouTube page at Letters and Politics, and there you can even leave a question or a comment that I can try to work into today's program. John Nichols, a very good afternoon to you, your time. Thank you so much for taking this time to join us today.
It's a great honor to be with you, Mitch, and I appreciate your great words about Bob Baldock.
Of course, you knew him. Yeah, you came here with some of the events he organized.
I did. I certainly did not know him as well as you did. But I'm familiar with the stories, and also just someone who values the station and values the people that built it.
Yeah.
And I know we're at that stage where we're losing them, and it's always sad. So I appreciate your good comments.
Well, whenever I'd do one of his events, I would host his events. I was never the main attraction, but I'd be the host of people like yourself. And every time I did it, he would buy me in appreciation a expensive bottle of whiskey or rum. And my whole office at the station is just full of these bottles of hard alcohol that came from him. None of them are open. Just to be clear, none of them are open. But if we ever get to broadcast back in the station, because we're still remote, if we ever get broadcast again in the station, we'll have to open one of those bottles in remembering Bob Baldock. John Nichols, we are about 2 weeks away from an extremely important midterm election. There's a lot to talk about, and we hope to get into all of it. But let me begin. The big question is, are the Republicans going to win back Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate?
I think they have a very good chance of winning back the House of Representatives. And our job here is not to tell people what they want to hear necessarily, but to give them as clear a picture as possible. And the clear picture of what's happening in the House races is this: the Republicans won the redistricting fights of 2021, 2022. That means they drew the districts that they wanted, not in every state, but in a large number of states. And when that combines with the headwinds of a midterm election in which you're the party that's out of power competing against the party that's in power, they've got at least a minimal advantage. We don't know how much. That's what's a little unclear at this point. I would say that if the election was held today, there's a decent chance the Republicans could win the House by 4 or 5 seats. And obviously, what that means is there's also at least an outside chance Democrats could still hold it. The challenge is as you move into a midterm election, usually things tend to open up a little bit. You tend to see one party kind of begin to get its advantage. That's what happened in 2018. It's what happened in 2014, 2010. You go back all the way. And so we've still got some things up for grabs, but I'd say that's a likelihood. Now the Senate races are a different game. There is still a pretty good chance that Democrats could hold the Senate. They might even possibly increase their position a little bit. It's a 50-50 split now. They could go to 51-52, not assured, but within the realm. And then as we go on, we could talk about gubernatorial and state houses as well, which are a bit more of a mixed bag. But Democrats apparently holding their own in some places that might have surprised folks at the beginning of the year.
Let me come back to the House of Representatives. When you say Republicans may win it by 4 or 5 seats, that's actually not picking up a whole lot of seats. That means they would win more seats than Democrats in this election, but not. It's already a very tight, almost evenly divided House of Representatives. So that means they're only picking up what, like 8 to 10 seats,
something in that range. Yeah,
I mean, historically, the first midterm for a new president, is very hard for that president's party. And of course, we're going through very difficult times right now in this country. I'm actually surprised that it's going to be that you think it's going to be that close. Not that I think you're wrong, but I'm surprised that it would be this close.
Well, I mean, I think we have to start looking at the factors this year, right? It is a midterm election. Usually the party in power loses seats in a midterm election. So that goes against the Democrats. We've got some pretty nasty inflation going on, and people too tend to vote their pocketbooks. And the economy is a very major issue, so that's going to also go against the Democrats because, as we could talk about later, I think the Democrats have done a lousy job of presenting an economic message in this cycle. But against that is the reality of the Republican Party as it's currently constructed, which is pretty much a personality cult oriented around Donald Trump. And that has made the split on elections much clearer, right? I mean, it's that people who might usually vote Republican or might be inclined to vote Republican in a cycle like this they can't stomach Trump. They're upset by him. They see him as troublesome. They've seen all the scandals, the controversies, the legal issues. So that's a factor because most of the House candidates, most of the Senate candidates are quite aligned with Trump. Then there's a second factor that I think you cannot underestimate. And that is the Dobbs decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. I think that is a real factor in a number of districts across the country, and I think that helps Democrats because America is a pro-choice nation. And the last thing is something that's a little more. It's a little hard to put your thumb on exactly, but it is sort of an anxiety about the state of our democracy. That relates somewhat to concerns about Trump. I don't think there's any doubt of that. But I think it actually runs deeper. And in this regard, I think the Democrats have done a better job of presenting themselves as the party that is more faithful to the basic tenets of a democracy than the Republicans. And so I think they may be getting a bit of an advantage there as well.
Explain to me why, and again, we're forecasting here.
But terrible thing to do.
I mean, it could turn out very differently, and it's always possible. And especially these kind of elections, it's hard. It's hard to get a sense of really what's going on. But explain to me, how is it that Republicans could win more seats in the House of Representatives, but Democrats still are in position to perhaps win more seats in the Senate, or at least keep it even?
Hmm. That's actually a pretty easy thing to do, because the House of Representatives is designed to be much more responsive to the winds of the moment, so to speak, right? So it is a place where you do tend to see the bigger shifts in a midterm election always. But then you also have the reality that redistricting and gerrymandering, literally the drawing of the districts, has created districts in a lot of places around the country where it's very hard for Republicans to lose. Not impossible, but much harder. And so House districts, House races tend to be more uh, sympathetic to the Republicans in this cycle, right? A place where they've got an easier ride. Senate races are statewide. And as a result, you don't have that ability to design a district that's going to be particularly favorable to your party, as Republicans have done in a lot of states. And then there's another factor too, that this is the playout. 2022 is the playout of the 2016 election, 6-year terms. And so as a result, you've got in 2016 a pretty good year for the Republicans. You've got some vulnerable Republicans there, some Republicans who could theoretically be beat. And then final thing is you had some Republican retirements that were significant, and that you lost some candidates who probably would have won if they had run for re-election. Thinking of Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania. You had a stand down in Ohio with another reasonably popular Republican. These are folks who I think got out because they may have feared their primaries more than a general election. And then I did say a final thing, but now I've got my last one, and this is really the exclamation mark on the whole list. Donald Trump meddled in a whole bunch of Senate primaries, and he succeeded in getting people nominated who were almost certainly the weakest possible Republican candidates rather than the strongest possible Republican candidates.
That's the focus of your article that's coming out tomorrow at thenation.com. You focus on Georgia, was it Pennsylvania,
Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Tell me about those three.
Well, they're pretty interesting states. Those are all states that have historically been battlegrounds. Pennsylvania and Georgia were critical battlegrounds in the 2020 presidential election, and actually, at least to some extent, in the 2016 election. In 2020, they both went relatively narrowly for Joe Biden, and that was a big deal. That very much helped Biden to win the presidency, along with the flipping of Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So they're a big deal in that regard. They're always historically competitive. Ohio, a less competitive state. We'll talk about that in a moment. But what happened was that this is the kind of year where if the Republicans nominated solid statewide elected official, maybe a state treasurer, a member of Congress for a Senate seat, they would be in a pretty good position, right? If that was a credible candidate who was running pretty much mainstream campaign. And in all of those states, the Republicans had such candidates, right? They had potential candidates, business people, political people, etc. But Trump came in and he forced, in each of these races, the party to consider, and ultimately because of his appeal to the party base, to choose candidates who were not traditional candidates in any sense. In Pennsylvania, he threw his weight behind Dr. Oz, the TV doctor who's always trying to sell you pills that'll make you thinner, without having to exercise. In Georgia, he went with Herschel Walker, the former football star, who's obviously historically a very popular figure because of his football record, but a person who it turns out has a lot of vulnerabilities as a candidate, personal challenges, and just seeming lack of preparation for the race. And then finally in Ohio, and Ohio is a state that really has trended more toward the Republicans, so should have been a pretty easy win for the Republicans. But in Ohio, Trump got in and picked a candidate who was actually trailing far behind in the Republican primary, J.D. Vance, the author of the book Hillbilly Elegy, another celebrity. And, Trump succeeded in getting Vance through the primary against several, far more rooted candidates in Ohio. Vance hadn't even lived in Ohio for much of his adult life. He lived in California. He was an investment banker. He wrote a book that did pretty well. They made a movie out of it and stuff like that. And that really excited Trump. But, Vance was an untested candidate, and he's turned out to really be a bumbler. And so in all three of these
What does
cases,
that mean?
you
A bumbler.
a bumbler. He screws up a lot. He says things that blow back on him. He has a record that makes him look a little bit like a hypocrite. He wrote Hillbilly Elegy, which is a book about working class, rural, circumstance challenges, and yet he's an investment banker who lived much of his adult life in California, and so it's a guy who, as one of his critics says, it fits rather uncomfortably into his plaid shirt.
Do you are all of these three races in particular in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, are they competitive? Do you think
Mm-hmm.
Democrats hold on
Yeah.
to these seats? I mean, or is it possible even everything that you lay out there, these Republican candidates could still win?
Oh, Republicans could still win. I mean, this is the nature of the year. If Democrats win, there's no guarantees that they're going to win any of these by a wide margin. Um, Here's where it stands right now. In Pennsylvania, John Fetterman, the lieutenant governor, who's a remarkable non-traditional candidate. He's won statewide in the past, and he was former mayor of a small city in Pennsylvania. But he's run a very kind of freewheeling, kind of fun campaign where he's picked a lot on Dr. Oz. He's taken some bold stands. He's very strong supporter of legalizing marijuana. He is a solid supporter of expanding health care and stuff like that. Pretty progressive guy. But he's run a fun, lively campaign. He had a setback because he experienced a real health scare right before the primary, and that laid him up for quite a while. He's still in some recovery from, there's a lot of, I won't go into all the details of it, but it really did put him in the hospital for quite a while. And then as he's been in recovery, it's slowed him down a bit, but not apparently so much, certainly not so much that he hasn't been able to appear on the campaign trail, etc. So the end result is that at this point, Fetterman tends to have a lead in the polls of at least a few points, sometimes even a little more. He looks to be in the most solid position. In Georgia, you had a situation where Herschel Walker was running pretty even with Senator Raphael Warnock, the former pastor at the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s church, and this guy who had this remarkable personal story, got elected in the special election early in 2021 and is running for a full term. And it was a tight race. It was a hard race. But in September into October, early October, there was a ton of revelations about Herschel Walker. These were on top of previous revelations, and including the charge that he paid for an abortion as an anti-abortion candidate. And he initially denied it. Then the woman involved came forward with documents. Then he sort of acknowledged it. Now he's acknowledged it more. So it's been a weird, awful kind of soap opera where he struggled to get his story straight. And then there was a debate between the two candidates about a week ago. And it was just, I think the only way to refer to it is it was really a mess for Herschel Walker. At one point, he pulled out a badge claiming that he was somehow tied to law enforcement, but it turned out to be one of those badges they just give away to anybody. And he was in a situation where he literally was saying it's not a prop, and the moderator was saying yes, it is a prop, put it away. And people in the crowd were laughing. And so there's been a lot of factors that have tended to help Warnock. Even now, I still think it's a close race, but Warnock, I think, maybe has a little bit of an advantage. The last one talking about there, and there are many other Senate races to talk about, by the way, some very important ones. But the last one to mention is in Ohio. It's roughly a dead heat right now. Generally, the polls have put J.D. Vance minimally ahead by a point or two, but that's incredible that Tim Ryan has gotten it that close. And there is a sense that Ryan has a bit of momentum. Again, they had a debate the other day, and it was quite a striking juxtaposition where J.D. Vance was kind of making all of his charges about Ryan, and Ryan came back at him in a incredibly blunt language and said, look, you compared Donald Trump to Hitler, and then you turn around to become one of Trump's biggest supporters, and Trump refers to you as an ass kisser. And J.D. Vance objects to this and tries to push back. And basically, Ryan just keeps referring to him as an ass kisser, which is not a term you hear a lot in debates, Mitch, but it if you're trying to appeal to blue collar workers, especially in a swing state like that, I think there was a general sense that Ryan had the stronger performance.
The Pennsylvania election, election, is interesting to me. Fetterman, the Democrat, again, who had a stroke,
Yeah.
he's still doing his thing, but it has perceptibly affected him somewhat. You can see it and hear it, and it's something that Fox News has really harped on and has taken clips of him sort of
Hmm.
pausing at long periods of time, maybe having a momentary getting lost in thought, which we all do, and playing those clips over and over and over again, very much the same way they do on Joe Biden,
Yeah.
about Joe Biden, and it'll be very interesting to me to see how that turns out in the election, if that's effective or not.
I think your point is well taken. And I mean, look, Fetterman doesn't deny that he went through a horrible health scare. I mean, he was very lucky to get to the hospital in time to get the care he did. Generally, the doctors involved have said this is it's a process of recovery, and that the likelihood is that kind of with each passing day, he's in a better place, right? And uh, there was initially quite a bit of sympathy for Fetterman, and Dr. Oz sort of stepped in it foolishly by sort of picking on him a little too early. Now, as it gets closer to the election, I think there has been a push and pull around that reality, but I don't necessarily know that it's hurting Fetterman that much. Again, one of the things that Fetterman has done in Pennsylvania that's really fascinating is that he has run a different kind of campaign than almost any Democrat in almost any state I've seen in modern times. And that is that he has said from day one, he's going to go to every county in the state, to every corner of the state, to the rural areas, to places that voted for Donald Trump. Now, Ryan is doing a bit of this in Ohio as well. In fact, Ryan has to do it because Ohio was pretty strongly pro-Trump state. But Fetterman he's certainly working in Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, the cities where you expect to get a big vote. But he's really moving around the whole state. And the interesting thing is, because he's coming to places where they don't usually see Democratic candidates, he tends to be getting a very enthusiastic response, right? And that makes it, even though you're right that he is in this recovery, there's sort of a dynamism to his campaign. It feels like it's a hardworking campaign that's going a lot of places. Doesn't feel like a campaign, being run from, a campaign office and doing, just speaking on video and stuff like that. So I think that in an odd sense, Fetterman's energy, his willingness to go statewide, his willingness to do that, has benefited him in this moment.
This is Letters on Politics, and we are in conversation with John Nichols of the Nation magazine about the upcoming midterm election. Again, we are taking listener comments and questions for folks who are listening to us live throughout California. You can give us a call at 1-800-958-9008, 1-800-958-9008. We are also broadcasting live on our YouTube channel. You can just find us at Letters and Politics on YouTube, where we're also taking comments there that I'll try to work in the air. In fact, I'll begin there. This is a comment from Mira Martin Parker. It's a fair comment. She says, "Why are only chocolate and vanilla on the ice cream menu? Why are black cherry and strawberry excluded from our selection offerings?" Of course, I think what she's referring to, John, is the fact that we're just talking about Democrats and Republicans when we talk about this midterm election. We do know that there are other parties, much smaller parties. This is an age-old question that we're always dealing with. But what is the status of whether it be insurgencies from outside of the two main parties, or is this a battle that's kind of still happening within the parties? How would you respond to somebody who's like, here we go again, talking about Democrats and Republicans?
Oh, I think it's exactly the right question. I'm glad we started on it. As people know, I'm a huge backer of multi-party democracy. I think the United States would benefit tremendously if we were like Germany, which has 5 or 6 major parties, the United Kingdom, which has 3 national parties, and then some very strong regional parties, or parties in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. I would prefer that. That's what I like. But the reality is that our system is weighted toward the Democratic and Republican parties, overwhelmingly so. Our media tends to cover them overwhelmingly. And then the final reality is that the impact of Donald Trump I think, has been to really kind of push people into, much more tightly defined camps, right? And the Democrats have benefited from that as being the opposition to the Trump Republicans. Trump Republicans obviously becoming a kind of a more cohesive force there. Doesn't mean there aren't independent and third-party candidates making important races around the country. And one that I would highlight is in Utah, where Evan McMullin is running against Mike Lee for the U.S. Senate. And Evan McMullin's campaign as an independent is very, very interesting. He's a relatively conservative former Republican, left the Republican Party when Trump came along, actually tried briefly to run for president as an anti-Trump conservative. He has moderated some of his positions and really sought to build a kind of multi-party coalition running as an independent candidate against very conservative Mike Lee in Utah. Polling shows it's a relatively close race, and this is a fascinating circumstance because we have states in this country that are overwhelmingly on the side of one party or the other, and that makes democracy there pretty weak. Pretty a thin soup, so to speak. What McMullin is proposing and trying to do is to develop a model where even in a state that's very heavily weighted toward one party, as Utah is toward the Republicans, you could develop an alternative grouping. And intriguingly enough, in Utah, McMullin is running with the support of some Republicans, of some traditional independents, of the Democratic Party, and intriguingly enough, a situation where Mitt Romney, the other Republican senator from Utah, has refused to make an endorsement in the race. So that's a lot of stuff up for grabs there. It's an interesting race to cover, and it's also one I would note, because of McMullin's strong opposition to Trump, that if he were to win, and let's say the Senate was at a 50, 49, and 1 split, there is, at least some hope that he would align with the Democrats, at least on some key organizational votes.
Forgive me if this question is from left field, no pun intended, but why do we only have a two-party system? It's not in the law that says you have to be either a Democrat or a Republican. What makes our system specifically that we have two parties that are in power?
It's a great question. Look, it not only isn't it the law, it's nowhere in the Constitution, right? It's this is a really important thing to understand. Our Constitution doesn't even say that you vote in November, right? You know what I mean? Or at least in the founding era, it didn't even say that. And so many of the structures of our politics have been developed, basically by a quote unquote gentleman's agreement between Democrats and Republicans. They have sort of carved the system up in their own favor. And so in states across the country, there are structural benefits that accrue to the two major parties. They don't have to petition themselves onto a ballot line, as third parties often have to. They have, kind of like a guarantee of a place on the debate stage, a guarantee of, all sorts of other advantages. This is, that Bob McChesney and I have written a lot about this. Our media system does a horrible job of covering, dissident, challenging, third-party independent politics by and large. Our media may cover an independent candidate early on in a campaign, but as you get closer to the election, they tend to push that independent or third-party candidate, out of the framework, and it really goes back to that, he said, she said, two-party duopoly. And so again, there are a lot of there are rules that have been put in place in a lot of states that benefit the two parties. There is a lot of kind of traditional practice that benefits them, and there is a media system that tends to overcover them without covering dissidents. Then, and layered on all of this is money in politics, which tends to very much go to the major parties. And so if you're trying to do a third-party campaign or you're trying to do an independent campaign, you so often have to build from the ground up. You literally have to create it in each election cycle, or even if you've got a little bit of the base, as the Greens do and as the Libertarians do, you still have to ramp it up in so many ways, whereas the Democrats and Republicans come with built-in advantages. It is something that we should definitely be talking about how to alter, and there are ways to do it, frankly, quite easily, with ranked choice voting, which opens some things up, not all, and or with proportional voting, as they have in many European countries. And just if we had that, you'd very quickly start to see, much more of an opening up.
Let's go to the phone lines. We're going to begin in Los Angeles, where we are joined on the air by Raj. Good morning, Raj. You're on the air.
The pundits always say that the election after the presidential, there is a term for that. I forget that. Anyway, they say the party which won the presidency loses seats in the Congress and Senate and all that. But then it's not a rule to be applied all the time. Once in a while it won't. That rule doesn't apply. And I feel this year it could be that because when Obama became president, there was a lot of I know people who were angry, who are not Democrats, who are a little white, and they didn't like a black president. And he said, I got a shellacking after that 2 years. We lost Congress and the Senate. This time it may not happen because the situation is all different every time. This time, economy is going down, but Biden does everything to prop it up. And, we had the COVID-19. Anyway, all that stuff. So it could be this year, it could be a different scenario with Congress and Senate being staying Democrat. What are the chances of that?
Appreciate that, Raj. John, Raj brings up a good question. There is no rule that the opposing party will win in the midterm election. I think in the last 100 years or so, we've only had twice when that didn't happen. One, 34 in the
34 was
the
a
Great
big,
Depression, and then in 2002 after the 9/11 attacks.
Yeah, I think you can also point to 1998, where the Republicans were preparing to impeach Bill Clinton, and they thought that was going to give them a big boost, and in fact, it didn't. Most things kind of remained static, and a lot of Democrats pulled through that.
But that wasn't the first midterm election of his presidency.
That was the second midterm. Yeah, if you're looking at the first midterm, truthfully, 2002 you can look at a little bit. There was some good results for Democrats that year, but it was basically Republicans tended to hold their own. The big one, the one that everybody looks at, is the 1934 election, and that's 2 years into Franklin Roosevelt's term. Actually, barely a year and a half, because they used to swear presidents in March rather than January, and Roosevelt was on a roll. I mean, he was doing the New Deal, and it was big and powerful, and people said, we want more of this. And Democrats not just improved their position, but had a fascinating situation with third parties. The Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, the Progressives in Wisconsin, the Nonpartisan League in Minnesota or in North Dakota, all elected candidates as well. So you had the Democrats did really well, and the parties to the left of the Democrats did really well, and it created it came to be referred to as the New Deal coalition, and it was very powerful. That allowed Franklin Roosevelt to really implement a lot of what he did. And I think a lot of Democrats were hoping that, for a variety of reasons, 2022 might be that kind of election. That after a real national crisis, COVID, and all the both human and economic impacts of that crisis, which is ongoing, and the Trump presidency, which was proved to be quite unpopular. Trump lost by 7 million votes, etc. That perhaps 2022, if Biden did really big things and had a very, very good 2 years, that Democrats could really have one of those rare moments. I think that the evidence right now is that it's not so likely. That in fact, I think the inflation issue especially has proven to be a real factor in helping the Republicans. And remember, that's separate, right? That separates out from Trump. It separates out from Roe, and it separates out from a lot of the other issues we talked about. People voting their pocketbooks. They're really concerned about economics. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it is a reality. And the impact of that, I can tell you, before we came on the air today, I was talking to an acquaintance of mine who works in a rural county in Wisconsin that has a very strong Democratic Party. It's one of these, kind of outliers where the Democrats do pretty well in a predominantly rural county. And they were out. He said they had 45 people knocking on the doors on Saturday, and I said, well, what were you hearing? And he said it was really interesting. It was overwhelmingly economics. It was overwhelmingly inflation, and a lot of people were blaming the Democrats. And he said that the fact that they were at the doors, they could push back on that, right? And say, no, this is global inflation. There's all these problems all over the place to talk about things that have been done, but as this guy said, boy, if we weren't at those doors, if we weren't, working it, he felt, they'd be suffering some serious slippage.
Ben in Mendocino has been on hold for a long time, so let's get him on. Good morning, Ben. You're on the air.
Thank you for taking my call. I want to pick up on the last comment that inflation is the major problem. But here is what I think the Democrats are missing the point. Democrats have to get really, really angry and do what Franklin D. Roosevelt did when he got to pound his fist on the lectern and be angry about it and tell the American people that 50 to 60 or 70% of the reason there is inflation is because of the dirty tricks of the Republicans, starting with the oil company. McDonough, for God's sake, higher their prices 40 to 50%. This is an international coup that they are doing because Biden wants them to pay 50% taxes. The Democrats have to get angry.
Okay, Ben.
They have to pound their fist on the lectern. American people have to see that they are angry.
All right, Ben. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Ben. I write that story about once a month. I'll say something pretty similar to what Ben said, and I tend to share his view. I think that the Democratic Party, and I wrote a book about this, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, in which I argued that the Democratic Party has tended to become a managerial party. It tends to respond to big problems as a manager would, to say, oh, yeah, that's a problem. We'll see what we can do to adjust this or respond to that. The Republicans don't run as a managerial party. They ran as a reforming, even revolutionary party. They're saying, give us power and we'll fix all the problems, right? And so it's an uneven debate. And I think many times voters like what the Democrats offer. I think that's why Biden did as well as he did in 2020 as a calmer alternative to Trump. But when you've got real challenges, and let's face it, 8 to 10% inflation, rising gas prices in a lot of places, all these challenges, these are things that people really worry about. People concerned about where their 401k is at, because the stock market is so unstable. You need to have answers in that situation. And I think that as a rule, the Democrats in this election cycle have not responded with the boldness that they should. And I think this gets back to, again, these campaign finance issues, because the Democrats get a lot of money from corporate interests, from Wall Street interests. Republicans get more, but Democrats get quite a bit. And I think there is less of a tendency to speak as bluntly as the caller suggests, and say, yeah, we have inflation because of price gouging, because corporations are, jacking up their prices to make more money in a difficult situation, and to have a plan to address that. And so I share the caller's frustration, but I will tell you that at this point, we're getting pretty close to the election. We're getting into the 2-week window there. People are already voting in a lot of the country. And so for the Democrats, I think that some of the die is cast, and they have chosen to run a campaign that is, hits a bunch of issues, right? They are talking some about economics, and that's good. They're talking a great deal about abortion rights, and I think that's very good, very strong. That's an important, vital issue. They're talking about a number of other issues, somewhat democracy in some places. But the notion that there's like a clear, one single clear message has been, I think there's quite a bit of criticism around the country that hasn't happened.
Again, we are speaking to John Nichols of The Nation magazine about the upcoming election. We are taking listener phone calls at 1-800-958-9008. 1-800-958-9008. We're also broadcasting this conversation live on our YouTube channel, where there you can leave a comment as well. I could try to work it in. Let's go to our next caller, Avery in Antioch. Hello, Avery. You're on the air with John Nichols.
Hi there. I have a couple of questions. It's more inside baseball for us Californians, but I'm leaning toward voting yes on 29 and on 30, but I have a couple of questions. For 29, I was confused about this last time, and I still am this time, which is there's
Avery, I'm just going to put this out there. I don't know if we're actually prepared and equipped to talk about specific California propositions. We're looking more at kind of the national scene, and you'll forgive me for that. But do you have a question about the national scene?
About the national scene?
It would be irresponsible
Not
for,
so
for,
much.
for me
just,
to. Unless John.
I hope you have a little.
Yeah. Do you know what Prop 29 even is, John?
29.
I followed it a little bit, but I'm gonna say that my answer to that question would not be the question, or not be the full answer that the caller would probably prefer.
We just got to be.
And I suspect that you're going to be doing shows that will go deeper into the propositions in California.
Yeah, sorry about that, Avery. We just got to be careful, especially when we're talking about election issues, to make sure we're doing it just service. Let's go to our next caller, Mike in San Francisco. Hello, Mike. You're on the air.
Yeah, how you doing? First, I'd like to say I don't believe the Democratic Party is really a party of the left. They're totally dominated by corporations and also now, unfortunately, by the military-industrial complex. I haven't heard anybody talking today about the war in Ukraine, which I blame on the United States more than I blame on Russia. I believe we wanted this war. We wanted to show our power, also as a forerunner to what we're really concerned about is China. I don't hear anybody in the Democratic Party criticizing the war from an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist point of view, and I do hear it, believe it or not, from some Republicans. So my feeling about the Democratic Party is really very negative at this point. I will not vote for Republicans, but if we don't get a third party of the left, which I don't think is happening, we're in very, very deep trouble, and the country is in much, much worse trouble than what people are talking about, what the nation is talking about, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, Mike. Appreciate
That's
the call.
my comment.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that is an important intervention, because I wrote a piece a couple weeks ago about the almost complete silence of frankly both parties on foreign policy in this election campaign, and there are a few people who do talk about it. Ro Khanna, who's a congressman from the Silicon Valley area, has talked more about Ukraine and more about it in nuanced ways than a lot of other folks. Pramila Jayapal and Barbara Lee as well have talked about the need to, try and find some sort of solution, not just to have, this ongoing war.
Up to this point, they have supported military aid to Ukraine.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I mean, I was in Europe last week, and there are profound concerns about Russia's actions there, and I think people are generally, look at Putin in very negative ways. But at the same time, there are profound concerns about an energy crisis that may really slow down the economies of European countries as a result of the war. So there's a lot of nuance and a lot of discussion there, which we just we have not had. And I mean, it's a very, very disappointing situation. Again, no matter where somebody stands on this thing, the fact that we're not talking about it, and in a deeper sense, the fact that we're not talking about the price of the military-industrial complex for our society. I mean, we spend such a huge amount of money on the Pentagon, and then we turn around and say we can't do child tax credits. I think that does often harm the Democrats for having that lack of perspective.
The war in Ukraine has divided the left. I don't think there's any question about that, but it is an interesting, and somebody who's followed Congress for a very long time and followed lawmakers who call themselves peace lawmakers. We're now in a situation in which the United States is sending, and we could debate how justified it is, but military aid, and you can't. We are definitely part of a war. in Ukraine, and we have a situation on Capitol Hill where the lawmakers who used to be seen as anti-war lawmakers are the ones who are still, even though they may be more nuanced about it and maybe moving in a different direction, still supported the military aid to Ukraine. It's actually some small number, but some Republicans who are in opposition right now. Sort of a reversal of what we've seen in years past.
I do think I think that this is a factor, and again, what you want is the debate, right? You want people to be talking about it and talking about, about the war, about also, again, our spending on the military. And remember, since the war began, we sort of had blank checks for the Pentagon, increased funding, increased spending. And there are a few members of Congress, people like Mark Pocan and Barbara Lee, who really do talk about that Pentagon budget. There are candidates who are running. One candidate who will probably become a member of Congress, Delia Ramirez from the Chicago area, who's got a really solid, thoughtful position on foreign policy that's detailed and raises concerns about military interventions and stuff like that. So you can find them, but to the caller's concern, these are the outliers, right? These are the rare instances where you see something or some discussion. By and large, this is shaping up as a profoundly domestic policy election.
Why are progressive Democrats supporting it? What's their reason?
Supporting the war.
The military aid.
Yeah, the military aid. I think that when I talk to them, I hear some different responses, but generally it is a deep concern about Putin's territorial ambitions, about the sovereignty of countries that neighbor Russia, not just Ukraine, but also Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, countries that are very, very concerned. And also, in general, a sense that that this sort of war is not something you want to see in the 21st century, and that somehow putting weapons there might help to even the circumstance. But I ask often about the lack of focus on diplomacy, and like trying to end this war, which is very deadly and very destructive. And you'll get a tip of the hat to it, but not. Aside from Ro Khanna, who again I will give credit for talking about the need to explore diplomatic routes, you don't have a lot of people who are going there right now, and that is I think that to a lot of folks is a frustration. I will tell you quickly that when I was in Germany just last week, briefly, I was in a small town in Germany where there was a substantial anti-war demonstration. People in the streets, saying this we don't want. We don't want this war to expand. We don't want Germany to become more involved in this. And so there's a much more dynamic response internationally than there is, I think, in the U.S.
We are near the end of our time, but I am going to work in one more caller. This is Valerie in Mill Valley. Hello, Valerie. We're down to our couple final minutes, but you're on the air.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for taking my call. I have a question about Kevin McCarthy's statement on Social Security and Medicare, what they as the Republicans plan to do to it, to make it a line item voting each year. Each year they would vote on whether you have Social Security and the amount of money going to Medicare. I'm surprised that the Democrats are using that to bludgeon them with, because that is like...
Yes.
Sacred, I think. But
all right, Valerie.
I would love to hear your comment.
Yeah, I appreciate the call. Yeah, John, what's Kevin McCarthy?
Valerie nailed it.
Yeah.
I mean,
what's McCarthy saying he's going to do? What is this?
Well, I mean, there's a number. McCarthy is one of a number of Republicans who have suggested that Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid are sort of on the table in some ways. They all say how they love it and they wouldn't want to destroy it. But what Ron Johnson from Wisconsin and some other members in the Senate have suggested is that they do want to actually, on a regular basis, have a debate about how much money to budget for it, take it out of a protected position and put it kind of into the budget debate. The fear in a situation like that is that there, in many circumstances, you might see cuts, or at least efforts to diminish, increases in support for Medicare and for Social Security. That the Democrats have not made this a huge issue and exploited some of the things Kevin McCarthy has said is to be dumbfounding. And I would agree with the caller. I think that I just don't think that Teddy Kennedy and Tip O'Neill and the Democrats of the past would have let this one get away from them. I think they would have made this a huge issue. And I scratch my head trying to figure out why the Democrats haven't talked about it a great deal more in this cycle.
John Nichols of The Nation magazine has joined us for a conversation about the midterm election, which is now just about 2 weeks away. You can read his latest piece. It's going to be published tomorrow about the Senate elections at thenation.com. John Nichols, always a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
It's an honor to be with you, and a great set of calls. Really a pleasure to answer the questions, or at least try to answer them.
That does it for Letters and Politics. The show is produced by Deanna Martinez. Kristen Thomas is the engineer. You can find shows of our archives online at kpfa.org. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I thank you for listening.